Welcome to the UCLA Department of Architecture and Urban Design Lecture Series. Before beginning the introduction of our speaker, Bernard Stiegler, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank our chairman, Toshi Abe, for not being here today, and also the various parties who made this event possible, which include Kenneth Reinhardt, the Program of Experimental Critical Theory here at UCLA, Arne de Bover, Director of Aesthetics and Politics at CalArts, and the French Consulate. So I'll introduce now. It's a pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Stiegler, who is the Director of IRI at the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris, a Professorial Fellow at the Center for Cultural Studies at Goldsmith College in London, and a Professor at the University of Technology of Compiègne. Yeah. All together. Where he teaches philosophy, because he's a philosopher, and he writes about philosophy as well: technology, digitization, capitalism, consumer culture. And central among his numerous books are the 3 volumes of La Technique et le Temps, Techniques and Time. The first one, which was published in English in 1998, The Fault of Epimetheus, in 2008, Disorientation, and in 2011, Cinematic Time and the Question of Index. So I was telling this to Bernard when he first got here, that it's becoming increasingly rare to have a philosopher on lectures, among the lecturers listed on lecture posters in our field. But this wasn't always the case. 20 years ago, nearly to the day, November-December 1993, the journal Architecture New York, known by the acronym NE, was guest edited by something of a philosopher. I say that. You may know him. He's sort of in between philosophy and something else, Mark C. Taylor. Taylor was, at that point, a professor of religion at Williams College in Massachusetts, and his topic for the issue was electrotecture. I don't know if any of you were even alive to see it, but I remember it. It was a strange issue of that strange magazine. And Taylor's neologism, electrotecture, was a way of capturing the total novelty of what was at that time being called cyberspace, which actually seems completely strange now to say that word, virtual reality. Looking toward the future, Taylor prophesied that everything would change in this new digital environment, especially architecture in the city. How could architects continue to think the same thoughts, design the same buildings as yesterday's, when the grid had become the net, when representation was being replaced by simulation? The discourse of electrotecture was therefore resolutely futurist, and it's not coincidental that Taylor, in his contribution to the issue, connected his views directly to Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto of 1909. The figure of speed had only been further accelerated, making text into hypertext, the real into the hyperreal, etc. And in the process of speeding up, Taylor explained certain things would inevitably be lost. Authorship, in its traditional form, would be eclipsed. Readers would be replaced with writers. Place would no longer have a strong hold on our minds or on our cities. Now, 20 years later, this futurism is in our past. While some things have changed, many more things have stayed the same. And while computers do affect every part of the field of architecture, we still live in buildings, we still live in cities, and we still have authors with us too. So why do I remind you of this strange episode in the history, or recent history of architectural discourse? Because it was 20 years ago, in that very issue of NE, that Bernard Stiegler's essay developing deterritorialization was translated into English and published in the context of architectural discourse. As I said, there was a moment where we had philosophers mixing amongst us. But looking back, there's an amazing difference in the tone between Taylor's prophetic insistence on a paradigmatic change and Stiegler's careful analysis of Le Roi Gourand and the work that had emerged out of the 1960s and the disappearance of the so-called ethnic community. The difference, in my view, was the claim over history. While Taylor claimed that the future was an acceleration of the present, Stiegler understood techniques as always already faster than culture. For Stiegler, following Le Roi Gourand, the history of the city and these are his words, is inseparable from the history of technology. The city, in its very essence, is technological. So if the city is an instrument, then at the center of his essay was the view that the city was a place of writing, another instrument, and therefore always the site of the technicization of the symbolic relations, of telecommunication, and deterritorialization. So, in fact, he makes a very elegant and nuanced argument about territorialization and deterritorialization, which I'm sure if you were to read the essay you would get the specificity of it. But what I'm drawing out from it in this maybe statement to our discipline, to our field, is that the net did not replace the grid. It was just one form of network produced in a long history of the city and therefore the history of the production of instruments. So the sort of instrument being the city. And as Stiegler wrote, the power of radical deterritorialization of territories that sets to work the global fulfillment of technology today is thus only the final consequence of an original, but originally forgotten process. Of course, this is a reference that Stiegler made very, let's say, powerfully in this essay as well as in his first book, which is to this original process the original process that he's describing is what he called the fault of Epimetheus, who forgot to give man equality, as he'd been distributing them to all the other animals, right? Man didn't get equality. And I invite him to dwell on the consequences of Prometheus' theft, which was to cover the forgetting of giving man equality, which was giving man the strange gift of the mechanical arts, which produced a very difficult, let's say, philosophical problem where man was outside of himself. So I hope that we'll continue in that line of thinking, I'm sure you will, in the lecture which Stiegler is giving us today, Toward a Generalized Automation. Please help me in welcoming
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very interesting remembering for me of this meeting in New York 20 years ago. In any, in fact, I lost the text. Maybe if you have it, I would like. That's true. Fine. Thank you very much for your welcome. The title of my lecture today is exactly Automatic Society. In a book which is now published in English, the title is What Makes Life Worth Living on Pharmacology. I've tried to show why the question of posthumanism is not a question, or at least not a consistent philosophical question. If it is true that philosophy is above all a discourse on what the question is, or if one prefers to dispense with the question of being, of essence, a discourse on what makes a question. Since then, I've devoted time to working on the new prospects and possibilities opened up by the neuroscience. And this had led me to the question of the relation between autonomy, psychobiological automatisms, technological automatisms, and regression. Ours is an age of widespread and general automation and automatization. This is a context that leads some to believe we should refer to posthumanism as the horizon of automatization are projected the figures of the cyborg and the golem, to the extent that biological automatisms and psychic automatisms are rearranged by and with technological automatisms. These rearrangements make it seem that the process of hominization that has taken place over the last 2 million years, and which we can understand as a process of externalization, has, if not turned against itself, at least turned in on itself. Technology is less and less what exteriorizes itself. Technology is increasingly that which is internalized. Today, when we refer to enhancement, it is less a matter of adding supplementary organs to the human body than it is a question of modifying and transforming the organs that constitute the psychosomatic body by technologically redesigning them from the inside, so as to make this interior, that one used to refer to as soul, compatible with control by robotic peripheral devices. This is currently being done, for example, to assist those suffering from hemiplegia. But here we are also talking about creating a compatibility with systems for the automated control of these souls themselves by submitting them to the kinds of social technical systems devoted to tracking and tracing that are presently being installed everywhere via generalized digitalization. All this may be true. Nevertheless, to refer this to posthumanism is to pass over a prior question, which is that of the relation between autonomy and automatism, which is also to say between autonomy and heteronomy. It is to dispense in the name of humanism with any reconsideration of the heteronomy conditions, that is, the technical conditions of autonomy. In fact, all this must be comprehensively revisited. And it is also to ignore the questions, both economic and political, that these heteronomy conditions insistently raise, and to do so at the very moment that generalized automatization is clearly bringing about a new age of heteronomy. In general, the relation between autonomy and heteronomy should be understood not as an opposition, but as a composition. In saying this, I'm raising a theme that I discussed in terms of political economy in the book entitled The Decadence of Industrial Democracies. To fail to do so would be to posit the inevitability of a post-human fate, a fate in which autonomy, conceived thus as pure interiority, would be lost in the heteronomization, in which the internalization of artificial organs, now becoming automata, will consist. In fact, however, autonomy is always and specifically constituted as the internalization of heteronomic artifactuality. The question of the posthuman attempts to raise the possibility that any possibility of questioning might be closed off forever. But aside from the fact that this question was already posed by Plato as the question of the pharmacon, and by Marx as the question of the proletariat, such a possibility is only a possibility insofar as it composes with another possibility, failing which it would not be a possibility at all, but rather the end of any possibility. possibility, the result of which would be a determinism where nothing is possible other than its own auto-fulfillment. There is another possibility, that is an alternative, which is that the age of generalized automatization could constitute a new age of autonomy, the conception of which would derive from a redefinition of past, present, and future autonomy, and as a relation to heteronomy that composes with it in a therapeutic manner, and not a toxic manner. If autonomy must be understood as a capacity to intensify the possibilities of individuation, and if, as I have long argued, by relying on Simoneau, psychic individuation is possible only on the condition that it contributes to and participates in collective individuation and technical individuation, then technical heteronomy, far from being the opposite of individuating autonomy, on the contrary, contributes to its development. This constitutes the horizon of the free software movement, for example, the thought behind the work of André Gorz, too, and the possibility of what I call with Ars Industrialis an economy of contribution. Before arguing these points in more detail, I must return to the question of posthumanism. The latter could be posited by or impose itself upon a way of thinking that can be called philosophical only to the extent that we accept that the question of humanism has been correctly posed. But I have myself always rejected the humanist way of questioning, which means the way of questioning that posits that the question of philosophy is above all the question of man, of the human. Now, rejection is not quite the same as Heidegger's, who rejects it in the name of the question of being, so that the question of man becomes radically secondary. I reject it because it is an obstacle for reasons that clearly intersect with those invoked by Heidegger from the side of the question of being, to thinking the question of techniques. It is an obstacle to thinking the question of techniques and humanism, and more particularly techniques as the inhuman that continually, always, and forever puts the human into question, and puts in question the question of man itself. Kant, Immanuel Kant, to whom I always try to stay as close as possible, but there comes a point at which this is no longer possible. And this is the point at which I try to do my own philosophy. Kant erected to philosophical rank the question, what is man? If he did so, it is because he was not himself able to pose the question of the schematism in the way required to provide what Derrida called a logic and a history of the supplement, that is, a thinking of iterability and therefore of repetition that can grant a difference, for speaking with Deleuze, namely as the projective possibility of a pharmacological field, and a schema is a projective apparatus. That brings the best and the worst, not the best or the worst of human beings. It should be noted in passing. Whatever may be the case for Kant, Dasein, in Sein Zeit, like Heidegger, does not pose the question of the human, but the question of being through the existence of this being who can question being, and who is Dasein rather than the human, and not just rather than the human, but before the human, earlier than the human. The question of being, which is the question of this privilege of Dasein, insofar as, in being the being who questions, it can inscribe a difference between being and beings, in being and in beings. A difference that is the time of being and the being of time as epochality, that is Geschichtlichkeit. It is not because Heidegger rejects the question of the human, despite what the essential analytic seems to suggest, which will fool Jean-Paul Sartre, that I myself dispute its philosophical necessity, but because, contrary to what Heidegger says, what makes this question possible, which is furthermore always also the question of the possible and its conditions of impossibility, as Derrida liked to say, and what puts in question the human itself, and does so by showing that the question is never just that of the human. This is techniques. What I'm talking about here, however, is no longer just a question concerning technology, for repeating the title by Heidegger of the Fellow's conference. Techniques, that is not a question, that posits itself to the being who questions, but that puts this being into question. It is a condition of any question. And in this respect, I do not believe that Heidegger truly grasped the question concerning technology in terms of the radicality of its questioning. Even if what we called unconcealment holds only on this question, on this condition. Heidegger was incapable of thinking this because he rejected the question of what I have proposed calling tertiary retention, in order to rethink what he himself called Weltgeschichtlichkeit. I will explain. Tertiary retention is a mnemotechnical support of memory. I apologize for having to recall these questions, but I raised at the end of Techniques in Time, first volume, The Fault of Epimetheus. I'm forced to do so because they constitute the grounds on the basis of which I want to investigate our own age in terms of a condition that automatically puts us into question, at the risk of interrupting all possibility of questioning. What posthumanism lacks is the primordial question of proletarianization. That is, the question of a primordial proletarianization, which is that of the pharmacon, and which is first formulated by Plato as a question of hypomnesis, which is the name of what I call tertiary retention. Hypomnesis puts into question the being that we ourselves are, I speak with the words of Heidegger, insofar as we are the being who questions. It is that which can always come to interrupt anamnesis, which is the name Socrates gives to what Heidegger calls questioning. I argue that this interruption is a technological epoche, suspension, and that this epoche, or interruption, this epoche always has two stages. The stage of putting into question and the stage of the formation, by Idea Henrik, Bildung in German, of this question at the constitution and transmission of a circuit of transindividuation, through which an understanding of being there, I use Heidegger's words, in its being, is established, and that is the constantly forgotten condition of all positively constituted knowledge. Positively constituted knowledge is anamnesic. that is autonomous, discovering its own law in itself, and as the inaugural possibility of thinking for oneself. But if it arises from out of the heteronomic interruption of and by hyponesis, and more generally from an artifactuality that puts into question, this anamnesic and autonomous knowledge finds its power in the ability to turn a moment of disindividuation, of interruption, of putting into question, of challenge, into a promise of individuation, a quantum leap in individuation, for speaking like Simondon, and of doing so through the adoption of technological epochal power and its transformation into psychosocial and social technical epochal power. We are challenged by techniques, and techniques is itself a process of individuation that both supports and threatens psychic and collective individuation, and that supports it through that which threatens it. Technical individuation requires the psychic and social individuals that it threatens. And this is the primordial pharmacological situation. Simondon taught us that the psychic individual can individuate itself only by contributing to a collective individuation. That the passage from the psychic to the collective, which engenders the trans-individual, is possible only with the support of that hypomnesic milieu, that is, the technical milieu associated with psychic and social individuals. This associated milieu is composed of artificial organs and the threefold process of individuation that constitutes the becoming of the pharmacological beings that we try to be by becoming what we are, by individuating ourselves. This must be conceived on the basis of what I call a general organology, where the three strands of the individuation of technical life, always simultaneously arranging the three processes of psychic, collective, and technical individuation, are three inseparable organological modalities: psychosomatic organs, artificial organs, and social organizations. These days, it is tempting to get caught up in the question of posthumanism, because the artifactual sphere that is constituted by technical individuation does tend to operate as a process of total automatization, reflected in the figure of the robot. The stage of total automatization is the more recent stage of a process of grammatization, that is, of the discretization and technical reproduction of human fluxes and flows, of which writing, that is Plato's pharmakon, is one stage. The machine tool is another stage, one from Vaucanson's automata, and where the digital is the extension of this to every sphere of existence in all human societies that currently subsist. The question being to know if societies, in the sense of collective individuation processes, can survive such a process of automatization. The question that the question of posthumanism avoids is that of the politico-economic choices that are opened up in the epoch of automated man, that is, in the age where the human being lives in an automatically administered society? Such a question, which presupposes a new critique of political economy, for which I have previously argued at the University of London and Cambridge, must firstly and profoundly revisit the question of the relation of life to automatism in all its dimensions, and in particular in the so-called human field, insofar as this is inclusive of technological automatisms, psychic automatisms, and biological automatisms, whereas in the animal field, automatism presents itself spontaneously as instinct. Automatism repeats. And if it is true that technical life is no longer governed by instincts but by drives, then to think automatic repetition must refer to Freud's discoveries in 1920. Discoveries which, passing through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, constituted the ground of Deleuze's meditation of the relation between difference and repetition, where the automatism of repetition, or repetition as the condition of the possibility of all automatism, is presented essentially as a pharmacological question. Deleuze would prefer to say problem. For, I quote Deleuze, if we die of repetition, he says, we are also saved and healed by it. Healed above all by the other repetition. The whole mystical game of loss and salvation is therefore contained in repetition, he says, along with the whole theatrical game of life and death, and the whole positive game of illness and health, unquote. That what Deleuze sees as repetition, however, is capable of producing a difference that is an individuation, as well as a baseness, which is when it disindividuates. This means that this repetition presupposes technical exteriorization, that is, grammatization as the possibility of a repetition that is neither biological nor psychic, via the hypomnesic and pharmacological support of repetition that grants a difference. That is, an individuation, and a difference with an A in the sense of Derrida, as well as a baseness, that is, an indifference and a disindividuation. In the 19th century, grammatization, which is the technical history of the repetition of discretized mental and behavioral flows that are in this sense grammatized, which is the history of the technical power of repetition, leads to automation, as it was described by Marx in the Grundrisse. And this constitutes a turning point in the history of repetition. Given that today, in industrial capitalism, economic development will occur only on the condition of putting bad repetition to work. That is, by implementing the kinds of repetition that result in baseness and indifference. This is the historical background constituted by man insofar as he is a technician that leads him to produce robots, made creatures, beings created by man and endowed with autonomy, creations of the human technician who might therefore produce what in Blade Runner were called replicants, but where the golem of the Talmud, of Sefer Yetzirah, and of Yehuda Lai already supplied the basis of the notion. The robot and the industrial realization of the golem amounts to an exit from the human being, the history of hominization. That is, it it is an exit from life insofar as it is characterized by its technicization of the process of exteriorization, enabling the putting in question of the question and questioning beings thanks to the very fact that it exteriorizes itself. To be put outside oneself either makes you furious in English, and as in French, to be beside oneself is above all to be furious, to lose composure, to lose control, to give in, if not to the instincts, then at least to the drives, or makes you dependent, alienated, subjected, and disindividuated. In our own epoch, this exteriorization leads to what proves to be a process of internalization rather than externalization, a process sometimes described as the convergence of nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science. It is justifiable to argue that if this situation does not insert us into the question of posthumanism, we are nevertheless indeed confronted with the question of a turning point, of a radical change of trajectory in that process which, across 2 million years, will have constituted technical life in the sense of Georges Pompidou, a turn, the result of which will be a new epoch of life. Life has had many epochs. The epoch of bacteria, of archaea, of protists, and other single-celled eukaryotes, right up to the aggregation of cells and organs, that we are ourselves, that is, these multicellular beings who cannot do without non-living organs, artifacts, prostheses, and eventually today, automata. As I prepared for this conference, for example, I searched among the masses of tertiary retentions, that is mnemotechnical traces, that we, living technicians, have produced for 2 million years and organized in the form of knowledge in order to find out about archaea, using Google and then Wikipedia, the latter being a collaborative site, although what we usually forget is that it also relies a great deal on so-called bots, that is, logical robots, which is an abbreviation for robots then, when by the latter we mean logical and algorithmic automata that are mainly used, I quote Wikipedia, mainly used to perform repetitive tasks that automation allows to be performed at high speed, unquote. The differentiation of the living unfolds from the parthenogenesis of single-celled organisms right up to the higher vertebrates, such as ourselves, endowed with both an endoskeleton and an endoskeleton and an exoskeleton, and surrounded by the exo-organisms and organizations that are human societies, producing a collective individuation founded on artificial organs, and passing along the way through the sexuation of multicellular bodies lacking a nervous system, such as plants, through invertebrate animals protected by an exoskeleton, such as the snail, the crab, the insect, and so on. Today, long after technical organs first appeared, this differentiation of the living has led to the automatic differentiation of the non-living, the production of organs and organizations where the difference between organic and inorganic is blurred in becoming industrial at the cost of an indifferentiation of life, that is, its decline, the loss of biodiversity as much as of cultural diversity. At each step of this history of the struggle of negantropy against entropy, that results from its becoming technical. And it is perhaps precisely this that defines the pharmacological, in other words, to be just Janus-like, to have one phase that is negentropic and another that is entropic. With every step of this history, then, each epoch of life implements new conditions of automatic repetition in which differences are produced. Differences that are generally related to forms of autonomy of the psyche defined by Aristotle as having three types, and as self-movement in autopoiesis in the theory of enection or activism, and passing through thinking as dialogue with oneself, according to Plato, or the conquest of maturity, Mündigkeit, for speaking with Kant, etc. But in order to understand what we are, and on the way to which we will have been underway for at least 2 million years, or 4 million years, if we believe the Laurent, and in order to understand it correctly, all this must be thought with the concepts of mineral, vital, and psychosocial individuation. Psychosocial individuation is the second epoch of automatism. There is nominal automatism. And this is why Canguilhem can claim that there are nominal monsters. When life reproduces itself, it repeats life in an automatic way. But within vital reproduction, there can be deviations that we can call monstrous, insofar as they do not automatically repeat the schema of the organic form that is reproducing itself. And this is what cannot happen to a crystal. The advent of psychosocial individuation, however, will in turn eventually lead to a generalized industrial automatization, founded on automation such as it began in the 19th century, with that fact described by Andrew Ewer and cited by Marx as, I quote, a vast automaton. It is a description of the factor in the Grundrisse. A new epoch of psychic and collective individuation thus emerges, which would perhaps take us not into a posthumanist process, if it is true that the man is the one who individuates himself with techniques such that he constantly becomes older, and such that the human adopts the inhuman or becomes inhuman from not reaching the point of humanness, and from failing to adapt himself by individuating himself. That is, from a failure to think and to realize this thought concretely, but rather into an inversion of externalization, where it becomes interiorization such that this technical internalization seems to induce a psychic disinteriorization. There is no exteriorization without interiorization, except in the case of proletarianization, precisely, the precise goal of which is to submit the proletarianized to an exteriorization of its knowledge without the need for re-internalizing what has been externalized. Today, neuroscience provides new evidence in relation to these questions. When we see how neuroeconomics applies this evidence, we can better grasp how significant are the stakes of what I believe we should describe as the age of the generalized automatization. Generalized automatization is what leads to the industrial development of a kind of robotics, which constitutes through ambient computing a robotized living space, which means that there is gradually less and less left for me to do. I no longer need to open doors, order groceries, and so on. And means that I gradually lose all my savoir-faire and my savoir-vivre, all my knowledge of how to do things and how to live. That is, I lose taste, because in French, savoir comes from saveur, sapere. It is what I call in French la vie savoureuse. La vie savoureuse is la vie who has knowledge. Which has knowledge. What I want to look at today are those bots, to which I referred earlier by citing the Wikipedia entry devoted to them, and where on Wikipedia itself, for example, such bots format the work of contributors like you and I, who, when we do not content ourselves with reading entries on Wikipedia, sometimes correct them, or even create them. Here, a certain amount of individual and collective autonomy is made possible by a technological and automatic heteronomy. I will return to this my conclusion. Wikipedia is a space of transindividuation assisted by logical and linguistic automata. A space that shows how an automated transindividuation can serve an autonomized transindividuation, if it may put it like that. Autonomized transindividuation designating then what used to be called sovereignty. But, however, presuppose an ensemble of apparatus to track and produce metadata, also involving RFID systems and an infrastructure of generalized automatization that should be described in detail. All this amounting to what Christian Fauré, a friend of me, entitled the transfer industry, which is on the way to changing the face of the human world. Transfer industry is Google, which could become the human non-world, in French, immonde. All this, which also involves the so-called Internet of Things, machine-to-machine or device-to-device communication, all this, which is still little known and largely underestimated, constitutes the industrial infrastructure of a new apparatus of reading and writing, not only between human beings, but also between robots and automated apparatus on the one hand, and humans on the other hand. The humans communicating between themselves via the bots and automata today. This is what makes it possible to scan groups with these data analysis technologies, that these automata are above all, and through that it becomes possible to anticipate and create behavior. For example, with those user profiling systems that everyone now knows about, and with performative effect of the big data processing in real time. One of these issues is to know how all this is articulated with psychic automatisms via the technologies emerging from neuromarketing. Without bots, Wikipedia would not work properly, and these bots in turn can themselves function only via the contribution of psychic individuals and collective individuals who develop through this, or at least some of them do, forms of knowledge, that is, perspectives on the autonomous world. Perhaps these foreshadows new forms of knowledge, those that should form the heart of digital studies, that is, the organological study of the knowledge and thought of man in the epoch of the digital tertiary retention. Studies that should not ignore scholars and contributors belonging to a much wider sphere than just those connected to so-called ubiquitous human computing. The latter consisting in making people do computer-based piecework and exploiting them through a process of decentralized prioritization in what amount to networked factories, where they perform tasks that are highly automated and which require psychic and not just technological automatisms. Here are the outlines or an alternative begin to appear. In automatic society, technological automatisms can be made to serve either an elevation and a transformation of psychic automatisms in a new age of the libido scendi, and more generally of the idealization and sublimation processes that are always potentially entailed by any process of formalization, or a regressive exploitation of those psychic automatisms that are the drives and archaic behaviors concealed within the so-called reptilian brain, which technological automatisms are, under the guidance of neuromarketing and neuroeconomics, able to solicit the drives by bypassing the short-circuiting the cortical zones dedicated to the internalization of knowledge, that is, to the constitution of capacities founded on anamnesic processes of adoption, of the hypomnesic possibilities proper to any particular stage of dramatization. Such would be the stakes of what we could call the philosophy of lifetime, of its shadows and its numbers, where automatization is on the dark side of the numerical as much as it is a new age of enlightenment, and where automatization as a social and scholarly project as much as an industrial project would lead to a complete renegotiation of the question of work and labor, where the delegation of those tasks constituting employment or jobs to automata is completely rethought. Within such a project, those automatisms that are realized concretely by robots would still make possible the delegation of functions that were previously performed by human beings, but only on the basis of a complete rethinking of the social project, and where the acquisition and formation of new forms of knowledge and new capabilities, in Amartya Sen's sense of the term, becomes the main way that work is remunerated, such work being no longer just a job. Here we would need to devote time to examine the proposals of André Gorz and Oscar Necht, but unfortunately we don't have the time. I will conclude. We cannot investigate any deeper into these questions without asking what it is in these various automatisms, and there are automatisms of exteriorization, technological automatisms, and automatisms of internalization, psychic automatisms. That means that processes of internalizing technological automatisms deriving from exteriorization can produce psychic and technical automatisms of a singular type in relation to purely machine-based or drive-based automatisms. Automatism or automata, in Vaucanson sense, automata as a technical object endowed with relatively autonomous movement. We may refer in temporal terms to the autonomy of the battery, for example, gives to the computer. For instance, my own device has 12 hours of battery life, that is of autonomy. Allows the reproduction of one or more operational sequences, that is, or one or many movements, and it is this that can take the place of a temporal sequence of human movements. In addition to the technological automatism that currently pervades the world in all its dimensions, there is an automatism of the drives. In this case, automatism presents itself as symptomatic automatic behaviors, and more generally as psychosomatic phenomena. Sometimes moves me, affects me, and I blush, or I blanch, I turn red, or I turn white. These are automatisms of my body. Or again, anxiety causes obsessional automatic behaviors, which in the head form a compromise between consciousness and the unconscious. My obsessional and as such automatic behavior indicates to everyone who sees it, except to myself, that something is not right. Such behavior allows me to hide from myself that something is wrong, to repress it, preventing me from expressing it to myself, while still letting me express myself, but in the form of automatisms, that is, by default and without seeing it unconsciously. Such automatisms of the unconscious and the heed, which are not those of the drives, but defense mechanisms against drive-based automatisms, are pathological in the sense that they produce a pathos, an emotion, an alteration that represses what I call a trauma type, and that engenders very specific stereotypes, memory being constituted from retention that are themselves organized by synchronizing stereotypes that contain diachronizing trauma types. The stereotypes of neurotics do, in certain situations, mean that they constantly repeat the same behavior. And here we are brought back to Deleuze, who explored beyond the pleasure principle of Freud, because they contain a trauma type that thus prevent from manifesting itself, that is, in an autonomous way. To develop this point, it would be necessary to pass through Derrida's archive fever, mal d'archive in French, where he refers to an archive drive, that is, a drive to exteriorize, a hypomnesic drive producing that what I call tertiary retention, that is, mnemotechnical retentions. I believe that this Derridian discourse on the relations between the drive and the archive, relations that constitute the crux of both technological and psychological automatisms, is, however, ill-funded. Mal d'archive interprets badly, gives a mal-interpretation, if I can say, of those archives that are the Freudian oeuvre. Derrida's archive fever is in many ways an extraordinary book, reopening the question first opened in 1962 by Derrida with The Origin of Geometry, and continued in 1966 with Freud on the Scene of Writing, in 1967 with Speech and Phenomena, and in 1968 with On Grammatology. Archive fever reopens the whole question of hypomnesis that is not formulated as such under this name, and the question of the pharmacon until 1972 in Plato's Pharmacy. Archive fever is the first true Derridean product of the history of the supplement that he promised in On Grammatology. This work constitutes, in a way, the psychoanalytic and Freudian prolegomena to a true history of the supplements, where Derrida asks in a long preface what would have become of Freud in an epoch where mail circulates at the speed of light, and what would have become of psychoanalysis with the mail and Google. By questioning along these lines, Derrida gives great weight to what I call tertiary retention, and this is what this is what I myself am trying to do. This leads him to say that the psychic apparatus is transformed by tertiary retention. In saying this, Derrida, who nearly 20 years ago is already writing about the consequences of digital and industrial tertiary retention, is extremely clear-sighted. He sees coming from a great distance those elements that will put us into question, will challenge and confront us in the pharmacology of the question presupposed by this challenge, by the technology of the question, and in relation to which he tries to create an anamnesic return of this putting in question through the hypomnesic return begun in 1962 and formulated as such in 1972. This return being a kind of anamnesis in 1985, that is archive fever, of his own journey, which is also the year when Deleuze committed suicide, if you remember. It is necessary here to consider 2 points that, due to time constraints, I will mention here, only to leave them aside for another time, and I will finish with this. On the one hand, the pharmacological question and challenge of and by the archive drive, that is, the drive to externalize, necessarily passes through Nietzsche and through his will to power. On the other hand, the archive as externalization is what puts into question Derrida's way of posing the question of this archive drive, that is, the way in which he relates it to the death drive. Not that I disagree that we should relate the archive drive, if we want to keep this formulation, to the death drive. In fact, I agree that we must relate it to the death drive. But because Derrida does not conceive the death drive correctly, he posits that the death drive is opposed to the pleasure principle, which is an astonishing counter-reading of the Freudian archive and of the Freudian question of the archive, such as it constitutes noetic life as archivization, that is, as technical life. Whatever its forms, life, which is defined by its reproductive capacity, in some way auto-archives itself, either under the pressure of Darwinian biological evolution or from an evolution of technological forms of the archive itself as what is externalized, deposited or sedimented, forming a technical milieu that is the condition of noetic life. The relation of archivization to technical life is an essential effect of the technicization of the life that is the noetic soul. To think in this way is to think the birth of desire as a capacity for projection and externalization, for the expression and impression of the soul at the arrangement of automatisms and autonomies, desire being what transforms drive-based automatisms, themselves being transformations of instinct into drives via the technical externalization of life founded on these removable organs that are the technical objects that archivize this life and that are the condition of constitution of what Freud understood as the fetish. Derrida the death drive to the pleasure principle, even though Freud says specifically that the repetition compulsion means that the question of libido is displaced from being just a question of pleasure or discharge. The drive is anarchic and, as such, anarchivistic. And the question of libido is that of the transformation of the drive as automatic into the autonomy of desire founded on the composition of the death drive with the drive-based automatic counter-tendency that is a life drive as a drive of vital reproduction. The desire is thus what arranges technical reproduction and vital reproduction as two automatisms, the composition of which is autonomous. The automatic process that is life, and in particular life endowed with a sexuated nervous system and a neocortex, unlike snails or slugs, leads through a transformation of these automatisms into a conquest of autonomy. It leads, in other words, to a leap into what Simon called psychic and collective individuation. In the context in which I am attempting to rethink the question of autonomy, which is also the question of automatization characteristic of our contemporary society, what hangs over the whole thing is the hyper-toxic reality of the automatic superego, that is, the disinternalization of the law as a foundation itself automatic. The law applies itself as a necessity and to everyone, even if interpreted by a judge or a jury of citizens, it continuously puts back into question and transformed its automaticity through jurisprudence, which is a disautomatization of the automaticity of the law. Today, automatization has reached very deep levels where neuronal automatisms, that is, the biological foundations of the drives, are arranged with the industrial automatism that emerged from the process of grammatization, of technical and mechanical reproducibility, of formalization and of digital treatment, in which archivization in lifetime consists, short-circuiting the anamnesic circuits acquired through idea and situated in the neocortex. These industrial automatisms systematically solicit the archaic neuronal automatisms of the reptilian brain and establish as a permanent threat an automatization in the service of the automatization of techniques such as Friedrich Stiegler, of the autonomization of techniques, such as Friedrich Stiegler has long anticipated, rather than in the service of noetic autonomy. Such an automatization attempts to subject noetic soul to an adaptative process, short-circuiting the process of adoption, in which the internalization of the superego consists. This is why, taking up an expression from Marcuse, I call the automatization of the superego. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud attempted to think from 1920 onwards both the automatic status of the drives insofar as they contradict each other, and the way in which this contradiction elevates them and sensitizes them into a dialogic of desire and libido that causes them to move from the archive of the drives to the archive of libido by propping themselves up, not just on the drives, but on this constitutive scratch of the psychic apparatus that is the archive, insofar as tertiary retention enables a transformation of the drive into an object investment. This archive is tertiary retention. However, the possibility of transforming the drive into object investment appears in Freud long before he thinks the drive as such. In 1895, then in his theory of sexuality, that is, at the point when he becomes interested in fetishism. The question of the fetish in that of tertiary retention, which as a proto-thinking of what will later be called the transitional object by Donald Winnicott, is an exteriorization of the drive, such that finding itself between two beings who are themselves drive-based enables them to share the exteriorization of their drives, which, since they are shared, means this is also a diversion of the aim of these drives, and this diversion, this difference with the A, constitutes the desire of those who share this object. This object that is no longer merely a fetish, but precisely a transitional object. What plays out before the mother, her child, in Winnicott also plays out in Freud between the Jews in the epoch of Moses and monotheism. But Freud does not, properly speaking, himself think this play. Autonomy in relation to the drive does not mean riding oneself on the drives, but rather transforming them into an energy that submits to a master. That is also a method, a metron in Greek, a measure that is desire. But the subject of desire is not master of its desire. Its measure is its lack of measure, its excess. This is here the figure of an amour fou that becomes social, and that through a drive of archaizing and of death will subdue its impulses, and so tame them that it results in a submission or even a destruction by the return of the repressed, when the moment occurs that a psychic automatism can be sublimated into an investment in a technical, hypomnesic, technological automatism, for example, in the form of science. This process of binding through archivization produces an heteronomic autonomy, dependence, as investment in singular object on the basis of which are around which this occurs, a process of psychic and collective individuation, and through which the amorous kernel produced by co-individuation becomes trans-individuation. I took this long detour so as finally to arrive at the question of whether there is a politics of automatization capable of creating a new age of autonomy. This is possible only on the condition of revisiting the question of libido scendi that constitutes the foundation of what is not just an archive drive, but a care of this drive and the maintenance of this archive and of that which in this drive, that is therefore archived and thus become knowledge, exceeds the drive while containing it. What is the digital, if not a form of writing? The digital is writing that can be inscribed and read by automata, scanned, as one says, at the speed of light. It is an essentially automatic writing and reading, in relation to which we should ask what it would have meant, not just for psychoanalysis, but also for surrealism. If the soul of André Breton, his psychic apparatus, has been supported by a digital brain, by a digitalized cerebral organ, I pose this question in order to state in conclusion the heart of my argument, namely that the noetic brain, the central organ of the psychosomatic noetic body, is essentially the organ capable of acquiring automatisms and of gaining something like autonomy, which in Plato is called anamnesis, the latter constituting the capacity to think for oneself, not in the sense that I would know the origin of knowledge, but in the sense that I only ever know by going back over each time the origin of all the knowledge that has always already preceded me, just as Dasein is always already preceded by its past. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
I think you raised so many issues, it's hard to actually pick a question, so I'm going to ask a question within a question within a question. The main issue that it seems to me that you bring up that speaks directly, at least to our field right now, is the status of the orthographic, which is something that you've written a great deal about. And the orthographic, and you brought it up today, the status of orthography, and in your work it stands as writing, in our work it stands as drawing, in a sense. But I'm wondering if, in a sense, does the philosophical project that attends to a kind of non-base automatism that you're describing, is that what you're describing as organology? And then the question within that would be, why are you calling it organology as opposed to what Simondon called it, which was mechanology? And that refers obviously to Compiègne's work on machine organisms. So I guess I'm just curious why you chose that term over his term, and how does that relate to orthography? Because it seems to me that in our own field, the question of robotics relates in a very indirect way to the question of history. What is the status of history in respect to something like robotics? Because robotics don't want to deal with orthography in some ways. Their processes are real-time processes. They're metadata processes, which is what you were talking about. Right? So the last part of that, the third piece of that, is what then for you, for your own philosophical technique, which I think is almost philological in the Nietzschean or Heideggerian tradition, what is the status of philology or even just the techniques of language that you use to create your own new concepts within that? So I know there's several questions in there, but I tried to make them related in some way.
Difficult questions. First about organology and mechanology. My problem with the Simondonian project of mechanology is that there is no pharmacology in mechanology. That is, in Simondon, the project of mechanology first doesn't pose the evolution of techniques or technology as a process of individuation. Strangely, he never says that it is a process of individuation, and I believe that it is a process of individuation, which is reducible in the psychic and social individuation, but which is different. And I say also organology because for me organology is not merely theoretization of the evolution of technical organs, but of organs in general, living organs and social organizations. And this is extremely important to think the links and, as Simon would say, the transductive relations between living organs, technical organs, and social organizations. Now, about the question of automatization in general, for me the main issue of this lecture is the question of the status of internalization or interiorization. There are two ways, two opposed ways of possibilities for internalization or interiorization. One is, for example, when you become a writer, like Marcel Proust or like Plato, you must firstly automatically internalize an automaton, which is writing. And you must transform your own brain in a new automatic machine, which it was not before learning how to write, before learning writing and reading. This automatization is a condition of an autonomy. It is the individuation of the lettered mind, if I use Walter Orn's expression. There is another possibility of internalization, which is to short-circuit, for example, your neocortical education, if I can say that, because each kind of education is a neocortical education. This is extremely important today to understand that neurology, neurosciences are showing that there are layers in the brain and that there are different regions or zones in the brain which are processed by different possibilities, political and social possibilities, in which, for example, you can, by an internalization, for example, a worker, a manual worker, you can make an automatization of its brain, which is short-circuiting the automatization acquired previously by the neocortical level, by, for example, education, etc., a worker or a consumer, or comment on appelle ça, les gens qui font un financial agent, I don't remember now, is a trader, etc. If you read, for example, an article published in London 1 year ago about the brain of the financial agents on the market of the city, it shows that they are in fact oriented to automatize their brain, but they short-circuit some possibilities of the brain. So, for me, the main question is how to design, to conceptualize, to conceive an organology which is an organological politics, if you prefer, which is based on the creation of lone circuits of transindividuation, not against automatization, but for an automatization which is producing negentropy and not entropy. And this means to study very precisely the relationship between epochs, techniques, brains, etc., and of what I call circuits of transindividuation. Knowledge, in general, my knowledge of a philosopher, for example, or your knowledge of a specialist of architecture, etc., is constituted by circuits, by what I call long circuits of transindividuation. And an automatization of this knowledge can either create the possibility of going far away in the long circuits, to go further in the circuit, or to make inaccessible those circuits for winning efficiency, performance, etc., but not at all art of architecture, for example, or intelligence of philosophical questions, etc., etc. This is what is at stake for me in these questions. I don't answer your question directly.
More questions? Or I have the mic.
I wasn't really raising my hand, Michael, but thanks for forcing a microphone down to me anyways. I wanted to ask you something, Bernard, which might seem a little bit out there. It comes out of your use of the terms autonomy and heteronomy. I was thinking about the fields from where I know these terms. Of course, there's philosophy, but there's also political theory, where these terms circulate and where they refer, at least in the way I've been understanding them, to a people giving oneself a law, autonomy, or a people receiving the law from somewhere else. Heteronomy, in the case of Moses, for example, and his people receiving the law from God. You used terms in your talk like soul, for example. In your other work also, the term belief is very important. I wonder how religion, I know this is a big question, but figures into all of this for you. I was thinking of this because of Freud's Moses and Monotheism book that you mentioned. I was also thinking of this because of Kant and the Enlightenment text and the role of religion in that, religion's relation to the Enlightenment in general. I was thinking of this because of Plato, also in the idea of the good, for example. You didn't talk about it today. I know you talk about it elsewhere. How is it present, religion, maybe the domain of the spiritual in general, and what you laid out for us today?
This is a big question and very important for me. When I finished my talk today, I wanted to repeat that what is interesting for me in Heidegger Dasein is that the Dasein is preceded by the already there, and you can have not an autonomy for Heidegger, but an authentic or genuine relationship to design only if you can receive the past and transform it in not in future but in being. Thinking for oneself for me doesn't mean an autonomy in which you don't receive. For example, in Socrates' dialogue, you think for yourself by a dialogue with somebody else, you know. And this is the other, and we could pass by Lacan here. This is the other who is, in fact, opening the access to your oneself, to yourself. And this is extremely important. Generally, when we teach philosophy, generally the first lesson of philosophy in France begins by Plato, thinking by yourself, etc. This is the beginning of philosophy, so this is the beginning of the course of philosophy in France. But the problem is that it is a way where you can understand that I think by myself, and after I will think with the other. And it is not at all what is at stake, not for Plato, but for Socrates, because this comes from Socrates. And it is the same question with religion. It's not the same question, but it is the same structure. That is, Moses, for example, received something which is revelation, and as you quote Kant, who speaks about religion as a necessity of a kind of revelation or writing, let's say, that is heritage or inheritage. You are always, firstly, a receiver. And the question here is, for me, what is very important in Winnicott analysis. Because when you see how Winnicott shows the production, if I can say, the construction, I don't know the term, of the desire of the child, of the baby, it is by this very complex scene in which you have not only a transitional object, but what is called by Lacan the symbolic, and that is something which is already there, in which only it is possible to produce desire. A desire which is only a singular desire, that is, which is necessarily your desire, and not the desire of the mother, for example, for the baby, etc. But producing this singularity, this originality, if we want to say that, or this autonomy of desire, you must receive it from somebody else. So it is a question of transmission. Behind your question, the question is one of transmission. And behind your question is also the question of the relationship between the political and the theological. Because what you call the autonomy in the political sense is always this question of from who is received the autonomy of the collective. It is what is at stake also in the book by Derrida about Jefferson and the origin of America, etc. Pardon? Excuse me. I can't remember in French the title of the book. Maybe, yeah. So, it is a very difficult question, your question. But you know that, as you said, for me, religion is very important because it is a question of credit and belief, which is sometimes I like to say that first, as Nietzsche said, we need a new belief, as Deleuze repeats in the second volume of Philosophy and Cinema. And I like to say that, saying this, we must know that God is died. That's clear. But the phantom of the ghost of God is extremely strong because God is died. So when we say, oh, God is died, now we are in the, let's say, live question. It's not so simple. And the question is, here, coming back, or something which is irreducible in an economy of the libido, in a libidinal economy, that is the third. You need a third term. And we see that in the economy of finance, and we see that everywhere now in the world. That is, we can't say it's finished, the question of religion. We are now in, no, it's not at all finished. Maybe it is beginning in a real question, not a simple social practice, but in a real question. I don't saying that we will come back to a religious path, not at all. But I want only to say that God, in the sense of Moses, for example, of Jewish and Christian societies, is the object of all desires. And it was already the question for Aristotle in Peripsyches. So, the anima. So, we have to go back to this question, which is also the question of idealization, infinitization, etc., etc., through Freud, but also through phenomenology, through critique and deconstruction of phenomenology, but also, I believe, through organology. Because there is no, for example, practice of these questions without instruments of the cult, without an organology. And I quoted the Bible with the golem, etc. So it's also the question of automatization on automata, which is opened in these questions. So this question is in front of us, not behind.
Another question for you about the psychoanalytic portion of the paper, especially about the question of pathology with regard to this archive drive. And I'm here referring to Freud's essay on Mourning and Melancholia, the distinction between, let's say, normal and pathological memory in that way, and how melancholia, you lose your capacity to recall by some kind of a broken chain. And this produces this infinity of melancholia. And in your story, I sense that there is a kind of pathological, a latent, maybe imminent pathology that you're describing. I'm just wondering if you can continue to use these just as a thought experiment. What would the melancholic pathology of archive drives be for you?
It's difficult for me to answer because I am melancholic. And it's very difficult. But maybe you are too, because my analysis of the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus is that melancholy is the origin of noetics. It's not original. Aristotle himself opens the possibility of thinking like that, but there are different sense of melancholy. There is a strict medical sense or psychiatric sense of melancholy. I'm not able to speak about this because I think it is a very complicated question to identify what is precisely the pathology, the psychiatric pathology of melancholia. I ask myself if I need to go to see the psychiatrist, saying that, you know. And me, the question of melancholy is directly created by the pharmacological situation. And in this sense, it is not the psychiatric use of the word, which is really a pathology in the medical sense of the word, but it is everyday experience of everybody, that everything is double-sided, and that it is impossible to solve this situation. And my own practice of melancholy, because I have, if I write, it is because I am melancholic. Only if not, I will go to swim or for a walk, etc. But I work a lot because I am melancholic, and I do this for trying to produce the therapeutic of my pharmacology, of my pharmacological consciousness of my own existence, if you prefer. My own existence is also yours, etc., of my world. And I believe that first we should revisit completely the concept of pathology as such. Firstly, I tried to do this in the book I cited at the beginning on pharmacology, where I tried to do this with Canguilhem, who is for me the most important thinker of the question of pathology, because he says that man is the one who is making him pathological in the double sense of to have pathos that is sense, experience, emotion, etc., and illness, etc. We must revisit this opposition between health and illness, for example, etc., because my attempt to think techniques is to it is a pharmacon which makes me ill, and which also is my future, my own possibility of individuation. And this is extremely melancholic. Makes me extremely melancholic, but it is also what makes my health, my therapeutic. But here we have also to revisit the concept of melancholy. I didn't read for a long time, maybe 20 or 30 years, the text on mourning and melancholy. It's mourning and melancholy in English? But probably I should read it. I think it is, all these concepts should be transformed by a pharmacological approach. But I didn't reread it recently.
You mentioned question of economics. I guess my question is a little large, and I don't know if I can borrow exactly your vocabulary. So, but when you're talking about this libido scendi, or this alternative to the short circuit, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about alternative economies, and if you relate archiving to, a certain relation to knowledge as the archive and as this melancholic process that you were just speaking about. Maybe we have to find other kinds of economies, either excess or destruction, or that aren't short-circuiting in the sense of a drive, but that are short-circuiting an attention or an attachment to the archiving as the process of individuation. And maybe it seems like we're under the sway of this debt economy so strongly that that's the question. So I was wondering what you think of it.
Thank you for this question, which is extremely important for me because it is, in fact, my goal to answer this question through this text and many others. I quoted Amartya Sen in my very shortly, briefly in my lecture today, because I believe that Amartya Sen, who developed the concept of capacitation, capabilities, etc., tries to think something which is close to what I call deproletarianization. And I believe that today, with the question of automatization, that is our status of tertiary retention, status of archive, of automated archive, in which this type of automated archive is the core of contemporary industry, particularly in California, but which is completely dominating now the whole world. I believe that we have to make a choice between what I call the society of the anthill, that is la fourmilière, you understand? Anthill, of the ants, where today we are producing using the digital archives, using the digital networks, etc. We are producing a lot of traces that we can consider like what is called in entomology pheromones of the ants. You know, we produce pheromones like ants, and it is possible to transform us, that is humankind, that is the earth, that is the global society created by internet and the digital, in something which is more and more close to the functioning of a hand. And we can, on the contrary, practice these technologies as technologies of deproletarianization, that is, of creation of new types of long circuits. Not only we can do it, but I believe that we are obliged to do it, because one consequence of what I said before concerning the global, the generalized automatization is the end of working, of jobs. We don't need anybody for the cash of the market. We don't need anybody for driving the cars. We don't need anybody for anything, in fact, now. If it was not developed now, it was because we needed a technology allowing the integration of all those possibilities. But now this technology is there. This is the reason for which Google is developing this car, completely automatic. And it's everywhere in the world now. All the big industries are working on this process of automatization. 3 or 4 years ago, I visited a factory by Mercedes in Germany where you have absolutely nobody, only robots, etc. And it is now possible to develop this, because the price of these robots is now has fallen down, and it is really possible to replace people by these robots. The problem is that if you replace these people by these robots, you can't give money to people, and who will consume what you produce with these robots? Not the robots. So there is an aporia, an economic aporia, in which it is absolutely clear that the only way possible is to rethink completely the distribution of time, which was with Henry Ford and Keynes, with the revolution of 1933 in America, with a kind of revolution, redistributing the time through money, because time is money, for consuming, for organizing consuming. It worked very well for, let's say, 40 years, very, very well. But now it will not work, not because of the conservative revolution and the ultra-liberal theory, but because the technology has completely changed the question. And the only way is today to give time to people to produce very long circuits of transmediation. That is to create a more intelligent society. Because if we don't do that, it will be the war, and the last one, that's clear. So, because automatization is also drones, etc., etc. Automatization is explosive, an explosive question. But it is our question now. In the 10 next years, everything will be automatized. So, the question is an economic and political one. And this is a question of time, of techniques and time. You produce time with techniques. You can produce time with techniques. Heidegger says it is not real time, it is calculation, computation. I disagree with this because I say Heidegger understands only techniques as computation. In fact, techniques is transitional object, is the creation of what I call tertiary attention, that is a possibility of inheritage, etc., etc. So the question is not techniques on the one side, bad time, and the real time on the other side, the genuine time, which is the time of the Dasein. Not at all. The question is the politics of techniques and time. How will you use techniques for producing what kind of time and distribution of time? This is the question. And this is also the question which is behind the MOOCs and the digital learning, etc. Because you can design these new services for reducing the cost of teachers, etc. But you can also completely reinvent what is teaching, what is not teaching, but knowing what is knowledge. And I believe that it is what we have to do now. So I developed a theory in France, which is a theory of what I call an economy of contribution, which is based on these ideas, and where I try to show that the model produced by the free software organization should be generalized and applied to all types of economic activity, and it is really possible today. But it is a choice of new kind of society.